No one in town believed it when they heard. A businessman who owned 3 restaurants, a man who never asked for help from anyone, vanished for 3 days without a word to anyone. And when he returned, he found his head chef sitting in his chair, running everything with a competence he'd never seen, holding a notebook filled with secrets that could either destroy or save everything he had built. What no one knew yet was that behind his disappearance lay years of silent betrayal, a name respected throughout the entire town, and a family debt that had returned to collect what was long overdue. This is the story of a woman who never complained, never asked for recognition, but when the time came, she was the only one capable of holding together what was about to collapse. And the price she paid to do it will leave your heart aching until the very last second. Stay until the end, because this story only makes complete sense there. The Chef Who Saved Everything. Chapter 1. The Day the Boss vanished. Monday began like any other day in Maplewood, Georgia, with the heat arriving even before the sun had fully risen, with the scent of damp earth rising from the quiet back streets of the old quarter, and with the hum of the town slowly waking, as if in no hurry, knowing the day would be long regardless. This was the rhythm of that small town in Georgia, a rhythm that Nara Jenkins knew by heart, inside and out, because it was within it that she had built 47 years of her life, one day at a time, one pot at a time, one morning at a time. Nara woke at 4:40 a.m. as always. She hadn't needed an alarm clock for years. Her body had learned on its own when to rise, for there was much to do before the world demanded anything of her. She brewed coffee on the old gas stove, the one that hissed a little before igniting, then sat on the wooden chair by the small kitchen window and gazed out at the street for about 3 minutes, the only luxury she allowed herself before the day swallowed everything. Then she stood, carefully folded the dish towel, placed her mug in the sink, and went to get ready. She had work. Drummond's Table was the largest of the 3 establishments that Arthur Drummond, 54 years old, had built over 2 decades in Maplewood. It sat on Main Street, right in the heart of town, with a dark green facade that Arthur himself had chosen because he said the color conveyed a sense of seriousness. The restaurant served lunch to local business owners, to workers from the surrounding farms and ranches who came into town for supplies or business, to families looking for a good meal without breaking the bank. It was a trusted establishment, and that trust had a smell, the comforting aroma of perfectly cooked rice, of slow-simmered collard greens seasoned with garlic and onion, of fried chicken that Nara prepared every Monday and Wednesday with a patience other cooks in town simply didn't possess. Arthur Drummond was the type of man who filled a room just by entering it. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep voice that preceded him, he had a habit of appearing at the restaurant at 6:30 a.m. before any other employee, and pacing through the kitchen as if he needed to see everything to believe it truly existed. He wasn't a bad man. He was a man accustomed to giving orders, and he had confused that habit with competence. To him, no one did anything right, unless he was around. This belief had made him indispensable by force, not because he was truly irreplaceable, but because he had never allowed anyone the space to discover they could replace him. Nara knew this. She had learned to work in silence alongside that man for almost 8 years, absorbing everything without him ever noticing. The way he negotiated with suppliers, the prices he paid for meat, the quantity of ingredients each dish required, the complaints that surfaced during slow weeks, and the decisions he made when cash flow was tight. She never commented on anything. It wasn't her place, or at least that's what Arthur implied every time she tried to offer an opinion on anything beyond the kitchen. But Nara noted everything. She had a black-covered notebook, bought from Mr. Eustace's stationery shop on the back street, where she recorded everything in the tiny, meticulous handwriting of someone who learned to write late and never stopped. Incoming notes, delivery dates, amounts paid, supplier names. It wasn't her obligation. It was a habit born of fear, the fear of a woman who had already lost everything once and had sworn to herself she would never be caught by surprise again. The story of that notebook began years earlier, when Nara was still married to Gary, a man with an easy charm and loose with commitments, who had vanished from Maplewood, taking the couple's savings and leaving behind 2 small children, Caleb, who was 7 at the time, and Lana, who had barely turned 5. She started a small meal prep business out of her backyard, noted every dollar that came in and went out, learned to negotiate with suppliers at the local farmers market every Saturday morning, and it was like this, cent by cent, that she paid off her debts, raised her children, and eventually arrived in the kitchen of Drummond's table 8 years ago, with a backpack and a handwritten resume that Arthur looked at for less than 30 seconds before saying he needed someone who would, show up early and didn't complain about overtime. Nara was left alone, with a rented house that barely fit the three of them, a debt at the corner store, and the certainty that she needed to understand the numbers before they swallowed her whole. On that day, the Monday that would change everything, Nara arrived at the restaurant at 6:20. The back door was locked, which was normal. What wasn't normal was that 6:30 passed, then 7 o'clock came, and Arthur Drummond didn't appear. Janice, the cashier, called his cell phone twice. Voicemail. Raymond, the kitchen assistant who had worked at the restaurant for 3 years, went to the front window to see if Arthur's car was parked outside. It wasn't. Toby, the longest-serving waiter, 51 years old, his brow furrowed with concern, murmured to Janice that this was very strange because Arthur never missed a day, never called in sick, and the one time he had been truly ill, he still showed up to open the register before heading home to rest. The question no one dared ask aloud, but that everyone heard echoing in their own minds, was simple. What now? Nara heard the murmurs, glanced at the kitchen wall clock, and did the math. It was 7:10. The restaurant opened at 11 for lunch. There was rice to wash, beans to soak, chicken to season, vegetables to chop, inventory to check, and the day's orders to confirm. If no one started now, lunch wouldn't be served. And if lunch wasn't served, the restaurant would stay closed. And if the restaurant stayed closed, the employees wouldn't get paid for the day. Nara didn't know where Arthur was. But she knew the stove was cold and that people depended on that fire to light up. She put on her apron, tied the knot behind her back with 2 quick movements, and said, without raising her voice, "Raymond, start washing the rice. Janice, open the register and check yesterday's change. Toby, set the tables and make sure we have napkins in stock." No one questioned her. There was something in Nara's voice at that moment. It wasn't earned authority. It was the voice of someone who knew what needed to be done and had no time for ceremony. And so, without deliberation, without a meeting, without any formal announcement, the 47-year-old chef became, that morning, the person who kept Drummond's table afloat. Lunch was served on time. The tables filled up. The beans were seasoned just right. The fried chicken had that golden crust that older customers recognized as a sign of dedication. Toby waited on tables with more attention than usual, as if the boss's absence had awakened a sense of responsibility in him that lay dormant when Arthur was around. Janice closed the register for lunch and handed Nara the daily sales report. They had served more people than the previous Monday. Nara didn't celebrate. She put the paper with the numbers in the kitchen drawer, washed her hands, and went to check the inventory for the next day. That night, back home, she warmed dinner for Caleb, who was 23 and worked at a mechanic's shop in the industrial park, and messaged Lana, who lived in Gainesville with her husband and young daughter. She didn't tell them anything about what had happened at work. Caleb noticed his mother was too quiet and asked if everything was all right. She said it was, drank a glass of water, and went to bed early. The second day without Arthur arrived even heavier. Early on, one of the produce suppliers called the restaurant's landline, saying there was a delay in delivery because the previous week's payment was still pending. Nara picked up the phone, asked the amount, wrote it down in her notebook, and asked the supplier to wait until 10 a.m. Then she went to the drawer where Arthur kept his receipts. She knew where it was because she had seen him open that drawer dozens of times, and looked for the proof of payment. She didn't find the receipt, but she found the restaurant's financial ledger, the one Arthur never showed anyone but left there, as if the drawer were a safe no one would dare open. She opened it. She scanned the notes carefully. The numbers matched, at least from what she could see. But there was a supplier's name that appeared frequently in recent months, Velmont Distributors, and she couldn't recall receiving any deliveries from them. It wasn't the supplier who had called, it was another, a name she didn't recognize. Nara wrote in her black-covered notebook, in her usual tiny handwriting, "Velmont, investigate." She didn't yet know what she was holding. But she had learned, in the difficult years after Gary left, that the problems no one examines are the ones that grow in the dark. And she wasn't afraid of the dark. She was afraid of being caught by surprise. At 10 o'clock, she called the produce supplier back, said the payment would be made by the end of the day, and asked for the delivery to go out at the normal time. The supplier accepted. The delivery arrived at 11:30. The restaurant opened. Lunch was served. When the shift ended that second day, Nara stayed alone in the kitchen for about 20 minutes after everyone else had left. She sat on the wooden stool near the counter, took the notebook from her apron pocket, and reread the notes she had made. The name Velmont Distributors was there. There had been 3 charges in the last 2 months, high amounts, all paid according to Arthur's ledger, but with no corresponding invoices in the folders she had sifted through. She closed the notebook. She stared at the wall for a moment. Outside, Maplewood's heat cooled with the arrival of evening, and the scent of oncoming rain hung heavy in the air. Nara didn't yet know that this name, Velmont Distributors, was the thread that, if carefully pulled, would unravel a web that had been woven by hands she knew, by a man the entire town respected, for over 2 years. She didn't yet know how much that black-covered notebook would be worth. She didn't yet know what Arthur had discovered, where he had fled, and in what state he would return. What she did know was what she had always known, that the work doesn't stop, that numbers don't lie, and that the people who survive are the ones who pay attention when others look away. The next morning, the 3rd day without the boss, Nara arrived at the restaurant even earlier. As she lit the stove and waited for the flame to catch, she heard the sound of a car stopping in front of the establishment. Heavy footsteps, the main door opening. She was sitting in Arthur's chair, the notebook open before her, when he walked in. The chef who saved everything. Chapter 2. The Man Who Came Back. Broken. Arthur Drummond was not the same man who had left 3 days earlier. This was clear even before he opened his mouth. His clothes were rumpled as if he'd slept in them. A plaid shirt Nara had seen him in before, now with a dark stain near the pocket, and sleeves rolled up haphazardly. His hair, which he always combed to the side with almost military precision, was disheveled, as if the hand that usually tidied it had forgotten its duty. There were deep circles under his eyes, the kind that don't come from one bad night's sleep, but from entire days without real rest. And his eyes, Arthur's eyes, which Nara had always described to herself as the eyes of a man who never doubted anything, were different. There was something in them that she recognized, because she had seen it in the mirror years ago, back when Gary left. The expression of someone who realized the ground wasn't as solid as it seemed. He stopped at the kitchen entrance. He looked at her. He looked at the chair where she was sitting, his chair, the chair that sat behind the small table in the corner of the kitchen where he used to sign papers and make calls. He looked at the open notebook in front of her, and he stood there for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were. Nara didn't stand up immediately, not out of defiance, that wasn't it. It was because her legs needed a moment to respond, because the surprise of seeing him there, so suddenly in that state, weighed more heavily than she expected. When she stood, she did so slowly, carefully closed the notebook, and said, with the calm voice of someone who had spent 3 days solving problems quietly, "Good morning, Mr. Drummond." He didn't reply immediately. He took 2 steps further into the kitchen, looked around as if he needed to verify if this was indeed his restaurant, and then let out a sound that wasn't quite a word. It was more a sigh that had tried to become a sentence and failed. He leaned his hand on the stainless steel counter and stood there looking at the floor. "Is lunch going to be ready?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. "Almost everything is ready," Nara replied. "Just the chicken needs to finish roasting. Raymond is arriving in half an hour." Arthur nodded, but it was an empty gesture, the kind the body makes when the mind is somewhere else entirely. He pulled out a chair, sat down outside the counter, and stared at the pots on the stove with an expression Nara couldn't name at the time. She only knew it was heavy. She returned to the stove, picked up the wooden spoon, and stirred the beans, waiting. She had learned that men like Arthur, men unaccustomed to needing anything, took their time to speak when they had something to say. Forcing the conversation would be like closing a faucet just as the water was starting to flow. So she waited, stirring the beans, adjusting the heat, checking the chicken in the oven, until he spoke. "You went through my drawers." It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, spoken with weariness. "There was an overdue bill from the produce supplier," she said, without turning around. "I needed to check the receipts to resolve it." Silence. "And you resolved it?" "I did." Another silence, longer. The smell of roasting chicken began to fill the kitchen. That aroma Nara knew was comforting to anyone who had grown up eating Sunday chicken at home with family. And Arthur had grown up that way, she knew, because he had once mentioned his mother, who raised chickens in the backyard in Collierville. "I had to leave," he said at last, as if that were explanation enough. Nara didn't say it wasn't. She simply said, "All right." "It's not all right," he replied, and there was a bitterness in that sentence he couldn't hide. "It's not all right at all." She turned then, because there was something in his tone that was different from anything she had heard in 8 years of working for that man. He had never shown weakness in front of her. He had never shown weakness in front of anyone as far as she knew. And there he was, sitting in that chair with his rumpled shirt and his hands resting on his knees, looking much smaller than he actually was. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" she asked. "I am," he said. "It's not that." And he said nothing more. Nara returned to the stove. The chicken was ready. She carefully took it out of the oven, placed it on a platter, sprinkled chopped parsley over it, and brought it to the service counter. Arthur remained seated in that chair throughout the lunch rush, only leaving when the first customers began to appear, as if the presence of outsiders bothered him in a way he couldn't handle. Before heading to his office, he stopped at the kitchen door and said, without fully turning, "You did a good job." These were the closest words to a compliment Nara had received from Arthur Drummond in 8 years. She didn't respond. She just continued slicing bread for the lunch service as if it were normal. But it wasn't normal, and she knew it. In the following days, Arthur returned to the restaurant, but he was different. He arrived later, left earlier, and spent long periods inside his office with the door closed, something that never happened before because he detested closed doors. Saying a closed door in a restaurant was a sign that something was wrong. He answered the phone with an urgency that didn't match his usual rhythm, and when he hung up, there was always a hardening in his face, a clenching of his jaw that Nara observed from afar without commenting. Toby, the waiter, murmured to Janice during a break, which Nara overheard unintentionally, that the boss seemed to be having health problems. Janice said she had heard he'd had a nasty argument with Robert Caxton, the silent partner, at one of the back tables of a dive bar on Riverbend Avenue on Sunday night, exactly the night before Arthur disappeared. Nara said nothing, but she filed that away in the place where she kept things that might be important later. Robert Caxton was a well-known figure in Maplewood. He was 58 with neatly cut grey hair, the kind of rancher's attire that costs a lot but looks simple. Khaki pants, a button-down shirt without a tie, an elaborately tooled leather belt. He was a godfather to many in town, attended the 8 a.m. Sunday Mass at Sacred Heart Church, and had sponsored the annual July 4th picnic at St. Christopher's Park for 12 consecutive years. No one spoke ill of Robert Caxton in Maplewood, at least not out loud, at least not to anyone who might repeat it. He had been Arthur's partner for 6 years, but a partner on paper, one of those who put in money and didn't show up day to day. At least that's what people thought. Nara knew him by sight. She had seen him enter the restaurant a few times, sit at a table with Arthur, order the daily special, and have coffee afterward. He always left a generous tip. He always left greeting the waiters by name. He was the type of man who knew that being friendly with lower-level employees was a cheap investment with a guaranteed return. She had never liked him. Not for any reason she could explain. It was something that got under her skin, a vague distrust that had no defined shape but was there. And there was a concrete reason for this distrust, a small reason she had recorded in her notebook months ago without knowing why. The name Velmont Distributors had first appeared on a note that Robert had personally brought to the restaurant, handing it to Arthur one Thursday afternoon, saying it was a delivery of supplies from a new company they were testing out as a partner. No delivery had arrived after that, but the charges kept appearing. Nara reread that note in her notebook 3 times that week, while Arthur closed doors and made calls in a low voice. She didn't know what she was seeing. She didn't know if it was a coincidence. She didn't know if it was something that didn't concern her. But there was an account in Arthur's ledger that didn't add up. There was a supplier who charged without delivering. and there was a man respected by the entire town who had personally introduced this supplier. On a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after Arthur had returned, Nara closed the restaurant after hours, went to Mr. Eustace's stationery shop, and bought a new notebook, larger, hardcover. She returned home, sat at the kitchen table with both notebooks open side by side, and began to copy and organize the notes, date by date, value by value, name by name. Caleb found her like this at 11 at night, with the kitchen light on and the reading glasses she was wearing more and more often. "Mom, what is all this?" he asked, looking at the notebooks. "Work," she said without looking up. Caleb watched her for a moment, with that son's expression that recognizes something in his mother he can't name, but knows is serious. He didn't ask anything else. He got a glass of water, left another on the table for her, and went to bed. Nara stayed up until midnight. The breaking point came without warning, as breaking points often do. It was a Monday in March, almost a month after Arthur had returned, when Janice arrived at the restaurant with a grim face and a piece of paper in her hand. It was the statement for the second restaurant, Drummond's Downtown Bistro, located in a busier neighborhood near the bus terminal. The month's numbers were bad. Not bad in the normal way, the way it happens when business slows due to a holiday or rain. Bad in a way that didn't make sense. Business had been good, tables full, the register humming. But the final balance was almost half of what it should be. Janice handed the statement to Arthur. He looked at it for long minutes with the paper in his hands, and then left without a word, with the quick pace of someone trying not to run. Nara, who was chopping onions at the counter and had observed everything over her shoulder, waited for the door to close. Then she went to the drawer, opened the restaurant's control ledger, and began to compare the values with what she had noted in her hardcover notebook. The accounts didn't add up, and the name that appeared amidst the inconsistencies, in the expense line that grew without explanation, was the same as always: Velmont Distributors. Nara closed the notebooks, took off her apron, hung it on the door hook, and went to the office where Arthur had locked himself in. She knocked twice. He didn't answer. She knocked once more firmly, and said, "Mr. Drummond, I need to talk to you about something important." Silence from inside. Then, the sound of a chair scraping. The lock being opened. The door opened. Arthur was holding the phone and had an expression that mixed exhaustion with contained rage. The rage of someone who had been holding something heavy for weeks and was starting to lose his grip. "What is it?" he said. Nara looked him in the eyes, one of the few times in 8 years she had done so on purpose, and said carefully, but without beating around the bush, "I think someone is siphoning money from the company using a supplier that doesn't exist, and I have the notes that prove it." The phone slipped slightly in Arthur's hand. He didn't drop it, but almost. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice in a tone that wasn't anger or surprise. It was something else. It was the tone of someone hearing a confirmation of what they already feared. "From my notebook," she said. "I've been writing everything down for 8 years. Arthur stood in the doorway for a long second. Then he stepped aside and said, "Come in." And it was there, in that small office that smelled of old paper and forgotten coffee, with the 2 notebooks open on the table and the ceiling fan spinning slowly above them, that Arthur Drummond told Nara Jenkins what he had discovered 3 days before he disappeared, and the name at the center of it all was a name she had already written in her notebook weeks before he even knew he needed to look for it. But as he spoke, as the words came with difficulty from a man unaccustomed to asking for help, Nara realized there was something Arthur still didn't know, something she had noticed that morning while comparing the statements, a small detail, but one that changed the size of the problem in a frightening way. Robert Caxton wasn't just siphoning money from the past. There was new, recent activity that suggested he was preparing to do something much bigger and much faster than Arthur imagined. The Chef Who Saved Everything. Chapter 3. The Burden of Silence. The ceiling fan spun too slowly to make a difference in the heat of that office. Nara was seated on the right side of the table, with the 2 notebooks open before her, and Arthur was on the left, his elbows resting on the old wood and his head slightly tilted forward, like a man trying not to drown. Between them, the papers and numbers told a story neither of them had chosen to be in. Arthur had spoken for almost 20 minutes straight. It was unusual for him. Nara had spent 8 years watching that man communicate orders in short sentences, without explanation, without context. But there, in that office that smelled of coffee and old archive paper, something had broken inside him, and the words came out with the weight of someone who had been holding it in for too long. He recounted that he had received on the Friday before his disappearance a call from an accountant in Atlanta. Not the restaurant's usual accountant, but a man who had conducted an informal audit of the accounting books of a company to which Arthur was a creditor. During this audit, the accountant had found documents linking a pass-through account to a shell company. The shell company, when checked, was registered under the name Belmont Distributors, with an address at a non-existent warehouse in a zip code belonging to an empty lot on the outskirts of Maplewood. The account holder linked to that shell company was Robert Caxton. Arthur had left the restaurant that Friday afternoon, before the end of his shift, without saying anything to anyone, because he had received that information and simply couldn't stay any longer. He spent the entire weekend trying to verify the documents, trying to understand the scope of the problem, trying to figure out if he had made a mistake that allowed it to happen or if he had been deliberately defrauded from the start. He concluded, after 2 days and 2 nights with almost no sleep, that he had been deliberately defrauded from the start. And that conclusion weighed more heavily than anything he had ever carried before, not because he didn't know dishonest people existed in the world, but because Robert Caxton was the man who had sat beside him at family events, who had clinked champagne glasses at his best friend's daughter's wedding, who had entered business with him with a handshake and a smile that seemed genuine. Nara listened to everything. When he finished, she didn't immediately state what she had noticed. She asked a question first. "Have you consulted with your local accountant, Gil Tesaro?" Arthur looked up at her. "Not yet. I didn't know who to trust. Gil is honest," she said, with quiet conviction. "I've known his family since my daughter went to school with his niece. He's not involved in this." Arthur looked at her for a moment, as if weighing the significance of that, not the information itself, but the fact that an employee knew things about the people around his business that he, the owner, did not. There was something in that realization that bothered him in a way he couldn't express. But he nodded. Then Nara opened her hardcover notebook and placed the page she had prepared the night before in front of him. She showed him the dates, the amounts, the frequency of Belmont Distributors' charges over the last 26 months. Then she showed him the next page, the one she had prepared that morning, after comparing the statements from the second restaurant with those from the main one. There was a recent transaction, recorded only 12 days prior, showing a significant transfer of value to an account that didn't appear in any previous records. It was different from the other transactions, faster, higher, without the gradual pattern the others followed. "This here," she said, pointing with her finger, "isn't like the rest. The rest was slow, so as not to draw attention. This is urgency." Arthur looked at the numbers for a long time. When he raised his head, there was an expression in his eyes that Nara recognized. It was the look of someone who realizes the problem is bigger than they had calculated, and that the time they thought they had is actually already gone. "How much time do you think he has?" Arthur asked. And in that question was an inversion that neither of them named, but that was there. He was asking her opinion, as if she were someone who understood such matters, as if she were, in fact, the most suitable person to answer. "I don't know," she said, "but if he realizes you're back different, that something has changed, he'll accelerate. People like that don't wait when they feel the ground shifting." The problem with Robert Caxton wasn't just the money. It was the position he held. In Maplewood, Robert was the kind of person whose reputation served as a shield. He knew the county clerk was a long-time client of the most respected law firm in town and had funded the renovation of the community center's basketball court in Central Park 3 years ago. If Arthur went to him with accusations without solid, irrefutable documentation, what would happen was predictable. Robert would claim there was a misunderstanding, call his lawyers, and Arthur would end up looking like the villain of the story, the paranoid partner who had accused a good man without concrete proof. Arthur knew this. That's why he had been paralyzed for 3 days. What he hadn't considered, because he had never needed to consider, was that there was a woman working in his restaurant's kitchen who had spent the last 8 years quietly writing everything down in a black-covered notebook. and that this notebook contained a precise chronological record that any honest accountant or lawyer would know how to use. The meeting with Gil Tesaro, the accountant, took place on a Wednesday afternoon in a back room of his office on Oak Street, with the blinds drawn because Arthur had requested discretion. Gil was 46, a methodical man with round glasses who rarely showed emotion. But when Nara opened the notebook in front of him and began to explain what she had noted, he took off his glasses, slowly cleaned the lenses, which Nara would later learn was his gesture when he was processing something serious, and reread the pages for 20 minutes in silence. When he finished, he put his glasses back on and said, "This, combined with the statements you have, is enough to open a formal case. But you'll need one more thing." "What?" Arthur asked. "The original invoice for the first Belmont delivery. If it exists, it will be registered in your physical archive. If it doesn't, and I suspect it doesn't, that absence, formally documented, closes the argument." Nara already had her cell phone in her hand when he finished the sentence. She had photographed the restaurant's physical files 2 days earlier because she had realized she would need those images sooner or later. She opened her gallery, found the folder, and turned the phone to Gil. He looked. He cleaned his glasses again. "No invoice," he said. "None," she confirmed. Arthur looked at the two of them as if he were watching a conversation in another language. Not because he didn't understand what was being said, but because he was trying to absorb the fact that the solution to the problem he had spent weeks unable to solve was being assembled before his eyes by a woman he had ignored for 8 years. What Arthur didn't know, and would only discover later, was that Robert Caxton had realized something had changed. Not because of the meeting with the accountant, that had been discreet enough, but because Toby, the waiter, had run into one of Robert's nephews at the dive bar on Riverbend Avenue that same Wednesday night and had commented without malice that the boss had looked like he was in serious trouble for weeks. The nephew had mentioned it to Robert, also without malice, because it was the kind of comment one makes out of habit in a small town where everyone knows everyone and information circulates like a breeze. Robert Caxton knew how to listen to the breezes. On Thursday morning, he appeared at Drummond's table for the first time in months. He arrived smiling, with his button-down shirt neatly pressed and his grey hair impeccable, ordered a coffee, and asked for Arthur. Janice said the boss was in his office. Robert said he'd just stopped by to say hello, that he was in the neighborhood. Nara saw him enter through the kitchen window. She paused for a second, spoon in hand, the beans bubbling on the stove. There was something in the way Robert walked towards the office, a calculated lightness, a smile he distributed to the waiters with the same precision as someone who knows they are being watched, that sounded an alarm somewhere inside her that had no name but rarely erred. She waited until he entered the office. Then she went to the kitchen door, which was in the corridor parallel to the office, and worked close enough to hear murmurs, unable to distinguish words, but sensing the tone. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. When Robert emerged, still smiling, he waved to Janice, drank the coffee he had ordered in 3 gulps, and left. Nara entered the office 2 minutes later. Arthur was sitting with a grim face, his fingers intertwined on the table. "What did he want?" she asked. "To say he was just passing by," Arthur replied, with bitter irony. "And to ask if I had thought about expanding the 3rd restaurant. Said he had an investor interested in becoming a partner." Nara stood in the doorway. "A new partner?" "That's what he said." She didn't need to explain what that meant. Arthur had already reached the same conclusion. A new partner meant access to the company's financial records. It meant transactions that would need to be justified. It meant Robert was trying to create a layer of complexity between him and the evidence before anyone could use it. "He's accelerating," Nara said, using the same words she had used days before. Arthur didn't answer, but the way he closed his eyes for a second was answer enough. What followed in the next few days was the heaviest period Nara had lived since the years after Gary left. It wasn't the kind of weight you could see. It was the invisible burden of carrying important information that couldn't be used before the right moment, of working every day in a place that was under threat without being able to say anything to colleagues, of watching Arthur visibly deteriorate, arriving later, eating less, responding to employees' questions with monosyllables, and knowing that the pressure destroying that man was the same pressure she was trying to help him resist. Her children noticed. Caleb reappeared in the kitchen late at night to find her awake with her notebooks. Lana called from Gainesville one Sunday afternoon and asked if her mother was all right. Said she seemed strange in her messages, that her replies were too short. Nara said she was tired from work, that it was temporary, that it would pass soon. It wasn't a lie. It was hope. What she didn't tell anyone was the part that weighed most heavily. There was a moment when she herself had considered stopping. There was one night, closer to the end of those weeks than the beginning, when she had closed her notebooks, turned off the kitchen light at home, and sat in the dark for about 15 minutes thinking that it wasn't her problem, that she was a chef. That she had worked 8 years for a man who had never given her a spontaneous compliment, who had never asked how she was, who had taken her work for granted with the same naturalness with which he treated the water from the tap. That those notebooks, those notes, had been made by her, for her, not to save anyone's business. And there was a truth in that thought she couldn't deny. But there was another truth too, older and deeper. There was Raymond, who had 3 children and an ailing wife, and whose salary came from that restaurant. There was Toby, who was nearing retirement and had worked there longer than anyone. There was Janice, who was a single mother just as Nara once was, who had gotten that job after months of searching. If the restaurant closed, if Robert Caxton succeeded in what he was trying to do before anyone stopped him, it wouldn't just be Arthur who lost. It would be everyone. Nara switched the light back on, opened her notebook, and continued. Robert's move came sooner than Gil had calculated. On a Monday morning, 2 weeks after his visit to the restaurant, Arthur received a notification from the bank informing him that there was a preventive judicial freeze on one of the company's accounts, the second restaurant, Drummond's Downtown Bistro. The account had been blocked based on an alleged unpaid debt to a supplier. The supplier was Velmont Distributors. It was a cruel and well-planned inversion. Robert had used the same shell supplier he had created to siphon money, now as an instrument for judicial collection. If the process proceeded, the company would need to prove it had no debt with Velmont, and to do so, it would need to expose all financial transactions of the account, which would open doors for Robert to allege irregularities and create enough confusion to buy time, or worse, to compromise Arthur's reputation before any evidence against him could be presented. Arthur read the notification sitting in his office with the door closed. When Nara knocked and entered, he was holding the paper, and his face was the color of someone who had just realized they'd lost a game they didn't know they were playing. She read the paper. She remained silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "I need to call Gil now." And before Arthur could respond, she already had the phone in her hand, because she had worked in that place for 8 years, and for 2 months she had known this day might come, and a lifetime of learning not to be caught by surprise had made her exactly the person who needed to be in that room at that moment. But what neither she, nor Arthur, nor Gil knew yet was that the judicial notification was just the first part of Robert's plan, and the second part was about to be executed in a way no one had predicted. It's the chef who saved everything. Chapter 4. When the ground gives way, Gil Tesaro arrived at the restaurant in 40 minutes. Nara had called at 9:17 a.m., saying only that there was a judicial notification and that it was urgent. And he had arrived at 5 minutes to 10 with his document briefcase under his arm and that grim expression of a man who had already understood from the phone call that the situation was serious. He entered through the back at Nara's request, who had been careful to say that it wasn't advisable for anyone in town to see Arthur's accountant rushing into the restaurant that morning. Gil read the notification twice. He cleaned his glasses. He read it a third time. "This is a preventive injunction," he said. "It's not yet an execution. It means he's still in the phase of creating the problem, not resolving the problem in his favor." "How much time do we have?" Arthur asked. "To contest, technically, a few days." There was something in the way Robert walked towards the office, a calculated lightness, a smile he distributed to the waiters with the same precision as someone who knows they are being watched, that sounded an alarm somewhere inside her that had no name but rarely erred. She waited until he entered the office. Then she went to the kitchen door, which was in the corridor parallel to the office, and worked close enough to hear murmurs, unable to distinguish words, but sensing the tone. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. When Robert emerged, still smiling, he waved to Janice, drank the coffee he had ordered in 3 gulps, and left. Nara entered the office 2 minutes later. Arthur was sitting with a grim face, his fingers intertwined on the table. "What did he want?" she asked. "To say he was just passing by," Arthur replied with bitter irony. "And to ask if I had thought about expanding the third restaurant. Said he had an investor interested in becoming a partner." Nara stood in the doorway. "A new partner." That's what he said. She didn't need to explain what that meant. Arthur had already reached the same conclusion. A new partner meant access to the company's financial records. It meant transactions that would need to be justified. It meant Robert was trying to create a layer of complexity between him and the evidence before anyone could use it. "He's accelerating," Nara said, using the same words she had used days before. Arthur didn't answer, but the way he closed his eyes for a second was answer enough. What followed in the next few days was the heaviest period Nara had lived since the years after Gary left. It wasn't the kind of weight you could see. It was the invisible burden of carrying important information that couldn't be used before the right moment, of working every day in a place that was under threat without being able to say anything to colleagues, of watching Arthur visibly deteriorate, arriving later, eating less, responding to employees' questions with monosyllables, and knowing that the pressure destroying that man was the same pressure she was trying to help him resist. Her children noticed. Caleb reappeared in the kitchen late at night to find her awake with her notebooks. Lana called from Gainesville one Sunday afternoon and asked if her mother was all right. Said she seemed strange in her messages, that her replies were too short. Nara said she was tired from work, that it was temporary, that it would pass soon. It wasn't a lie. It was hope. What she didn't tell anyone was the part that weighed most heavily. There was a moment when she herself had considered stopping. There was one night, closer to the end of those weeks than the beginning, when she had closed her notebooks, turned off the kitchen light at home, and sat in the dark for about 15 minutes thinking that it wasn't her problem, that she was a chef. That she had worked 8 years for a man who had never given her a spontaneous compliment, who had never asked how she was, who had taken her work for granted with the same naturalness with which he treated the water from the tap. That those notebooks, those notes, had been made by her, for her, not to save anyone's business. And there was a truth in that thought she couldn't deny. But there was another truth too, older and deeper. There was Raymond, who had 3 children and an ailing wife, and whose salary came from that restaurant. There was Toby, who was nearing retirement and had worked there longer than anyone. There was Janice, who was a single mother just as Nara once was, who had gotten that job after months of searching. If the restaurant closed, if Robert Caxton succeeded in what he was trying to do before anyone stopped him, it wouldn't just be Arthur who lost. It would be everyone. Nara switched the light back on, opened her notebook, and continued. Robert's move came sooner than Gil had calculated. On a Monday morning, 2 weeks after his visit to the restaurant, Arthur received a notification from the bank informing him that there was a preventive judicial freeze on one of the company's accounts, the second restaurant, Drummond's Downtown Bistro. The account had been blocked based on an alleged unpaid debt to a supplier. The supplier was Velmont Distributors. It was a cruel and well-planned inversion. Robert had used the same shell supplier he had created to siphon money, now as an instrument for judicial collection. If the process proceeded, the company would need to prove it had no debt with Velmont, and to do so, it would need to expose all financial transactions of the account, which would open doors for Robert to allege irregularities and create enough confusion to buy time, or worse, to compromise Arthur's reputation before any evidence against him could be presented. Arthur read the notification sitting in his office with the door closed. When Nara knocked and entered, he was holding the paper, and his face was the color of someone who had just realized they'd lost a game they didn't know they were playing. She read the paper. She remained silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "I need to call Gil now." And before Arthur could respond, she already had the phone in her hand, because she had worked in that place for 8 years, and for 2 months she had known this day might come, and a lifetime of learning not to be caught by surprise had made her exactly the person who needed to be in that room at that moment. But what neither she, nor Arthur, nor Gil knew yet was that the judicial notification was just the first part of Robert's plan. And the second part was about to be executed in a way no one had predicted. It's the chef who saved everything. Chapter 4. When the ground gives way, Gil Tesaro arrived at the restaurant in 40 minutes. Nara had called at 9:17 a.m., saying only that there was a judicial notification and that it was urgent. And he had arrived at 5 minutes to 10 with his document briefcase under his arm and that grim expression of a man who had already understood from the phone call that the situation was serious. He entered through the back at Nara's request, who had been careful to say that it wasn't advisable for anyone in town to see Arthur's accountant rushing into the restaurant that morning. Gil read the notification twice. He cleaned his glasses. He read it a third time. "This is a preventive injunction," he said. "It's not yet an execution. It means he's still in the phase of creating the problem, not resolving the problem in his favor." "How much time do we have?" Arthur asked. "To contest, technically a few days. To put together a contestation strong enough not to give him any room to maneuver, we need a week. Maybe less, if the documentation is organized." The two men looked at each other. Then both looked at Nara. She already had her hardcover notebook open to the right page. What happened in the following hours was the kind of work that doesn't appear in any grand narrative because it lacks glamour. It was just three people sitting around a small office table with papers spread out, the ceiling fan making that slightly irregular hum it always made, and Nara reading her notes aloud while Gil cross-referenced them against the statements, and Arthur remained silent, processing what he was hearing. There were moments when Gil asked a question, and Nara responded with a precise date, an exact amount, an observation she had made months ago without knowing it would be needed. There were moments when Arthur tried to contribute some information and discovered that Nara had already noted it before he even remembered. It was an inventory of Robert Caxton's negligence, inadvertently built by a woman he had never paid enough attention to consider a threat. At noon, Raymond knocked on the office door to announce that lunch was ready and the tables were starting to fill. Nara stood up, folded the paper napkin she had used to write down a phone number, put it in her apron pocket, and told Gil and Arthur that she would be back in 2 hours. She left, put on her apron, and went to the kitchen to serve lunch as if that morning had been perfectly normal. Toby saw her arrive in the kitchen and noticed something. He didn't know what, but there was a tension in her shoulders he rarely saw. He didn't ask. He just worked alongside her with more attention than usual, as he always did when he felt she needed space, but not solitude. Lunch was served. The tables were attended. The customers left satisfied. Nara washed her hands, hung up her apron, and returned to the office. The second part of Robert Caxton's plan arrived as a rumor. That same day, on Monday afternoon, Janice entered the office where Nara and Gil were still working. Arthur had stepped out to take a call in the hallway and said, in the low voice of someone who isn't sure if they should speak but feels they must, "I heard something that might be nothing, but I thought I should tell you." Nara looked up from the paper. "Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter, who works at the diner across from the county clerk's office, texted me this morning saying she overheard a conversation between two men waiting for service. One of them mentioned Mr. Drummond's name and said a story was going to break on a local news portal about irregularities at Drummond's restaurants." Gil took off his glasses. "What kind of irregularities?" he asked. She didn't hear clearly, but she said the man talked about a supplier problem and unpaid debt. Nara remained still for a second. Then she turned to Gil. "He's trying to use the press before we can contest the injunction." Gil closed the folder he was holding. "If a story about unpaid debt comes out before we file the contestation, it becomes a reputation problem on top of the legal one. In a small town, reputation destroys a business faster than any court ruling." That was exactly what Robert had calculated. He didn't need to win on legal grounds. He just needed to create enough noise for the restaurant's customers to start doubting, for the real suppliers to start hesitating to renew contracts, for the Drummond name to carry a shadow that, even if dispelled months later, would have done enough damage to weaken Arthur before any formal process reached a conclusion. It was a clever plan, and it was working because it was built with patience by a man who knew the dynamics of that town better than any outside lawyer could understand. Arthur walked back into the office at that moment. He read in their faces that something had changed. Nara told him what Janice had said. He listened in silence, with that expression she had learned to recognize in recent weeks. It wasn't defeat. It was the visible effort of a man trying not to let defeat settle upon him. When she finished, he stood still for a moment, and then he said something she didn't expect. "Why are you doing this?" The question came without anger or accusation. It was genuine, the kind of question that comes when a man accustomed to distrusting everything suddenly can no longer find a reason to distrust someone and needs to understand what he is seeing. Nara looked at him for a second. Then she said, "Because there are people here who need their jobs. And because I learned that a problem no one faces only grows." Arthur looked at her. He nodded slowly, as if filing away an answer to examine later. Gil, who had pretended to look at papers during the exchange, said without lifting his head, "We need to call Atticus." Atticus Hayes was the lawyer. 53 years old, bald, with a reputation in Maplewood for being the kind of professional who didn't like to lose because he took it personally. Arthur had used his services twice before, once for a labor dispute and once for a zoning permit issue, and both times Atticus had resolved it with the dry efficiency of someone who charges well and delivers on promises. The call was made that afternoon. Atticus listened to the summary, asked for everything to be sent in writing by the end of the day, and said that the contestation of the injunction could be filed within 48 hours if the documentation was complete. He also said that regarding the possible news story, there were legal ways to request a right of reply, and that if the story contained false and verifiably incorrect information, there were instruments to deal with that. When Arthur hung up, there was a different lightness in the room, not relief because the situation was still serious, but the feeling that the problem now had a shape, that there were walls around it, that it could be fought. The work of the next 48 hours was the most exhausting Nara had experienced in years. Gil needed the records organized in chronological order, with the amounts corresponding to Velmont's charges side by side with the company's bank statements, showing that the money had gone out, but no goods had been received. It was proof by absence. There was no invoice, no record of receipt, no employee signature confirming delivery. The money had gone out and disappeared. Nara's black-covered notebook was the backbone of that argument. She had recorded, unknowingly, all the incoming inventory she had received in the last 3 years. Date, supplier, quantity, who had signed for it. Velmont didn't appear in any of them. It was an involuntary and precise record of an absence that, in the context of that lawsuit, was worth more than any formal declaration. She stayed at the restaurant until 11 at night on the first evening, sitting at the office table with Gil, transferring the information to a spreadsheet he had set up on the computer. Arthur stayed until 9, left to deal with a problem at the third restaurant, returned at 10, and stayed until the end. When Nara left, the streets of Maplewood were empty, and the night's heat was that stifling heat that lingered even after sunset. Caleb was awake when she arrived. He was sitting in the living room with the television muted, waiting, with that way a child has, not knowing how to help but unable to sleep while their mother is out. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "But it will be." He stood, went to the kitchen, warmed the plate he had saved for her, placed it on the table without ceremony, and returned to his room. It was the gesture of a son who had learned from his mother that caring doesn't need words. Nara ate alone, in the silence of the kitchen at 11:30 at night, with her hardcover notebook closed beside her plate. There was a weariness that went beyond the physical. It was the exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time and begins to feel their muscles tremble, not from weakness, but from accumulated effort. She thought of Lana, in Gainesville, with her young daughter and calm husband, and the life she had built far from that heat and dust. She thought of how good it would be to have the kind of problems Lana had, small problems, problems of people who are doing well, the kind of problems that fit into a phone call and are resolved with a hug. Then she finished her plate, washed the dishes, turned off the light, and went to sleep. The contestation was filed on Wednesday afternoon. Atticus had worked quickly, using the material Gil had organized based on Nara's notes. The document was technical and dry, as all legal documents are, but it had a solidity that came from the quality of the evidence. Each date was correct, each amount was verified, each absence of an invoice was documented in a way that left no room for alternative interpretation. Arthur signed the papers sitting at Atticus's office table, with Gil beside him. Nara didn't go. She had stayed at the restaurant to ensure that the day's operations ran normally, because the restaurant still needed to open, lunch still needed to be served, everyday life continued to run parallel to the crisis, like two rivers in the same valley that don't mix but exist in the same space. When Arthur returned and said it was done, she merely nodded and went to check if the next day's beans had been soaking. But there was one thing that still hadn't been resolved, and that weighed differently from the others: the news story. The news outlet where the rumor had mentioned the story would break was the Maplewood Daily News, a local news website that had enough readers to cause significant damage in a town the size of Maplewood. Atticus had sent a formal notification requesting that any publication be preceded by contact with the company for a right of reply. But notifications take time to circulate, and an outlet that decided to publish before receiving the notification could claim they hadn't been informed. Nara learned this when Arthur told her, on Wednesday night, after the restaurant closed, and the two were alone in the kitchen for a few minutes. She finishing organizing the refrigerator, he standing at the door with his jacket folded over his arm. "If the story comes out tomorrow," he said, "no legal contestation will resolve it in a timely manner." Nara closed the refrigerator door. "Who owns the news outlet?" "A man named Silas Miller. He sells advertising to local businesses." "Does he know you?" "By sight." "And does he know Robert?" Arthur hesitated a second longer than necessary. "He does," he said. Nara remained silent for a moment. Then she said, "Let me try something." Arthur looked at her. "What do you want to do?" "I know Edith, the woman who cleans Silas Miller's office. We attended the same church for years. I'm not saying she'll tell me anything she shouldn't. I'm saying that sometimes a conversation between acquaintances often says more than any formal request." There was an expression on Arthur's face that mixed discomfort with something that was beginning to look like reluctant admiration. The look of a man who is recognizing for the first time truly that there is a web of human relationships surrounding his business that he had never seen because he had never needed to see it. "Can you do this without compromising yourself?" he asked. "I know how to talk to people," she said with simplicity. And she left. What Nara discovered in her conversation with Edith, the woman who cleaned Silas Miller's office, wasn't confirmation that the story was being written. She already knew that. It was something that completely changed the angle of everything. Silas Miller hadn't been approached by Robert Caxton directly. He had been approached by a younger man who introduced himself as a representative of a media company from Atlanta, who had offered a generous advertising contract in exchange for the outlet publishing a pre-written text, presented as an anonymous tip. Silas had been interested in the contract, but he had said he needed a few more days to consider. Those days were exactly the window Nara needed. She returned home that night with this information. She didn't call Arthur because it was late and because she had learned that not all information needs to be shared immediately. Some needs to be digested first, transformed from raw data into strategy. She lay in bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling for a while, organizing the pieces. Robert was in a hurry. He had used an intermediary to avoid appearing directly. The intermediary had offered money, not pressure, which meant Silas still had the freedom to say no. And if Silas said no, the second part of Robert's plan would collapse before it was executed. The question was, why would Silas say no? Nara had an idea, but she would need Arthur to execute it, and that meant that the next morning she would need to convince a man accustomed to giving orders to trust a strategy not created by him. She closed her eyes. Outside, the heat of Maplewood hung still in the air as always, unhurried, unpitying, indifferent to everything happening inside the small, flickering illuminated windows of the town. But inside one of those houses, a 47-year-old woman was, for the 100th time in her life, refusing to be caught by surprise. The Chef Who Saved Everything. Chapter 5. The Cost of Trust. On Thursday morning, Nara arrived at the restaurant at 6 o'clock, 20 minutes earlier than usual. It wasn't out of anxiety, or at least not solely. It was because she had learned in the years when money was tight and decisions were costly that the moments before the world wakes are the most honest. There's no noise, no external rush, and what needs to be thought finds space to exist. She lit the stove, put water on to boil, brewed coffee, and stood at the back door of the restaurant for a few minutes, looking out at the dirt backyard where the sun hadn't quite fully arrived. There was a peach tree in the corner by the wall, planted by someone before Arthur bought the property, that was full of green fruit. Every year, when the peaches ripened, they fell without anyone picking them because the restaurant didn't use peaches on the menu, and Arthur had never paid enough attention to the tree to think of doing anything different. Every year, Nara looked at those peaches on the ground and felt that dull ache one feels when seeing the waste of something that could nourish. She drank her coffee slowly, washed her mug, and went to prepare the kitchen for the day. Arthur arrived at 7:30. His shirt was pressed, his hair combed. There were still dark circles under his eyes, still the weight of those weeks etched on his face. But there was also an attempt at composure that Nara recognized as deliberate effort. Men like him couldn't stop trying to appear whole, even when they were in pieces. She was chopping onions when he entered. She said good morning without turning, and then said, before he had time to settle in, "I need to tell you something about Silas Miller." Arthur stopped. "What did you find out?" She told him everything. The conversation with Edith, the intermediary from Atlanta, the advertising contract, the days Silas had asked for to think. She told it with the objectivity of someone who had organized the facts overnight and knew exactly what was relevant and what was just noise. When she finished, Arthur was silent for a moment. "How do you know Edith told the truth?" "I can't be absolutely sure," she replied with honesty. "But I've known Edith for over 10 years. She has no reason to make this up, and she doesn't know enough about what's happening to realize that information was important. She told it like office gossip." Arthur nodded slowly. "And what do you want to do?" Nara placed the knife on the counter, wiped her hands on her dish towel, and turned to him for the first time since he had entered. "You need to go talk to Silas personally. Not through a lawyer, not a formal letter. Personally." "Why?" "Because Robert used money to convince him. And money from a stranger weighs less than the word of someone you know. Silas knows you by sight. That means he can still be reached before he makes a decision." Arthur frowned. "And what would I tell him?" "The truth," she said, as if it was simple, and it was, in a way. "That there's a lawsuit underway, that the contestation has been filed, that any story published before the judicial conclusion could put his news outlet in a very complicated legal position. Atticus can prepare a letter explaining this in technical terms. But the conversation needs to be from you, not the lawyer." Arthur looked at her for a long moment. There was an expression on his face that she hadn't seen before. It wasn't resistance. It wasn't the usual reflex of a man who questions everything that didn't originate from him. It was something closer to recognition, as if he was seeing clearly for the first time what had been in front of him all along. "You thought of all this last night," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Why?" he asked. And it was the second time he had asked that question, but this time there was something different in his tone. The first time there had been veiled distrust. This time there was an unprotected sincerity, the voice of a man who was no longer trying to appear as if he didn't need an answer. Nara remained silent for a second. Then she said, with the voice she used when speaking to her children about things that truly mattered, "Because I know what it's like to build something from scratch and see it threaten to collapse. And because no one deserves to lose what took a lifetime to build because of someone else's dishonesty." Arthur opened his mouth as if to say something, closed it, looked at the floor for an instant, and then said, in a voice that was almost breaking but didn't, "I never treated you the way you deserve to be treated." It was the last thing Nara expected to hear that morning. She stood still, hands on her dish towel, not knowing immediately what to reply. Because it was true. It was simply true, spoken plainly. And there was a weight there that was both a relief and an ache, like when an old wound is finally named. "You can correct that moving forward," she said at last, and she returned to the onions. Arthur went to speak with Silas Miller that same afternoon. Nara didn't go. Not because she hadn't been invited, but because she had understood that this part needed to be Arthur's. There were things that only worked when they came from the right person, in the right place. And a conversation between two men who knew each other by sight in a small town was one of them. She had given him the map. It was up to him to walk the path. She stayed at the restaurant, worked the afternoon shift, closed the kitchen at 4, and waited. Arthur called at 5:20. "He's going to hold the story," Arthur said. His voice was different, not exactly relieved, but less burdened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." Just like you suggested. A short pause. Atticus will send the formal letter tomorrow morning, but Silas said he won't publish anything until the case has a conclusion. Nara closed her eyes for a second. Good. He also told me, Arthur continued with a hesitation that seemed costly for him, that the representative from Atlanta had called twice last week, pressing for a deadline, said he had a timeline. A timeline for what? Silas didn't know, but someone who has a timeline is someone who's in a hurry. And Robert was in a hurry. Nara already knew that. But hearing the confirmation from an external, independent source consolidated the argument in a way that left less room for doubt. She hung up the phone, stood in the empty kitchen for a moment. The smell of lunch still hung in the air, that smell she knew so well that sometimes she couldn't separate it from the scent of her own life. Beans, spices, the sizzling of garlic, the smell of normal days, of work that continues regardless of everything. Then she went to her notebook, opened it to a blank page and wrote, in her usual tiny handwriting, Silas, check. Next, Robert. What happened the following week was the strangest period of the entire process. Strange, because there was a surface calm that hid the tension underneath. The restaurant ran, lunches were served. Toby smiled at customers, Janice meticulously checked the register. Raymond chopped vegetables, humming a country tune that Nara could never identify but had involuntarily memorized. On the outside, everything was the same. On the inside, Gil and Atticus worked on building the formal lawsuit against Robert Caxton. It was a meticulous construction. Every document needed to be verified, every date confirmed, every amount backed by statements. Nara had provided everything she had. Now it was the specialist's turn. But there was one element that was still loose. Robert was Arthur's partner under a contract signed 6 years ago, automatically renewed every 2 years, with an exit clause requiring 90 days' notice and an audit of shared accounts. This meant that even if the lawsuit was filed, Robert would have formal access to the company's records during the transition period, unless there was a preliminary injunction blocking that access while the investigation proceeded. Atticus had warned about this. He had requested the injunction along with the contestation of the freeze. But injunctions take time to be granted, and time was precisely what Robert was trying to buy. Arthur told Nara this one night when they stayed late at the restaurant, after everyone else had left. He was sitting in the same chair where he had been on the first day he returned. That kitchen chair where Nara had found him standing, lost, his clothes rumpled, and his eyes those of a man who no longer knew where the ground was. But now he was different, not resolved, not relieved, but present in a way that had been absent in those first few weeks. Atticus said there's a chance Robert might try to make a large transfer before the injunction is granted, he said. One last move to take as much as possible before the door closes. When? Any time. Today? Tomorrow? Next week? There's no way to know. Nara was silent. Then she said, Can Gil monitor the accounts? He's already doing that. And what if the transaction happens overnight, outside banking hours? Arthur frowned. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it might be worth warning the bank personally, not with a formal letter, personally. The branch manager here has known you for years. If he knows there's a lawsuit underway and that any unusual activity should trigger an alert, he'll pay different attention. Arthur looked at her. That expression again, the recognition that had become more frequent in recent weeks, less reluctant than the first time. You think of everything, he said. I think of what can go wrong, she replied. It's different. The meeting with the bank manager happened on Monday morning of the following week. Arthur went alone, as he had with Silas. He returned with the confirmation that the manager had placed an informal flag on the account. It wasn't a legal freeze, but it was an extra layer of human attention that could make a difference in crucial minutes. This was the kind of thing that doesn't appear in any manual, the web of personal trust that underpins small towns, the relationships that are worth more than any formal protocol because they were built over years of daily interaction. It was also the kind of thing Robert Caxton had exploited for years to build his own protection, and which was now being used against him. That same afternoon, Gil called Arthur with news that Arthur immediately went to the restaurant to tell Nara there had been an attempt at a high-value transfer recorded on the second restaurant's account that morning to an account in the name of a service provider company that had never been listed as a supplier. The bank manager had held the operation for verification, as had been informally agreed. The transfer had not gone through, Arthur told her, standing at the kitchen door, phone still in hand, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, a lightness that was almost incredulity, the voice of a man who had prepared to lose and was processing the fact that maybe he didn't have to. Nara nodded. She returned to the stove. "It's not over yet," she said without turning. "I know," he replied, "but we're ahead." He stood still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you staying for dinner tonight? Raymond made some fried chicken that isn't quite yours, but it's decent." It was the first time in 8 years that Arthur had done anything that resembled an invitation. Nara stood with her back to him for a second, hand on the pot handle, feeling the weight of it, not romantic, not dramatic, just human. The small gesture of a man learning, too late but still learning, that the people around him exist. "I can't," she said. "Caleb is waiting at home." And she left at the usual time, as always. What Nara didn't know, as she walked home that night with the orange sun of Maplewood warming her back, was that the lawsuit was about to reveal a layer none of them had calculated. A layer that concerned not just Robert Caxton and the siphoned money, but a decision Arthur had made years ago that was about to return, with interest, to change the course of everything yet to come. And when that revelation arrived, it would come from the mouth of someone Nara had known for years and had never imagined being at the center of this story. The Chef Who Saved Everything, Chapter 6. What Remains. When the Dust Settles. The revelation didn't come from where Nara expected. It came from Edith. It was a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Robert's transfer had been blocked, and 3 days after Atticus had filed the formal lawsuit with all the documentation organized by Gill. Outside, the heat of Maplewood still hung motionless in the air as always, unhurried, unpitying, indifferent to everything happening inside the small flickering windows in the town's darkness. But inside one of those houses, a 47-year-old woman was, for the 100th time in her life, refusing to be caught by surprise. The Chef Who Saved Everything. Chapter 6. What Remains When the Dust Settles. The revelation didn't come from where Nara expected. It came from Edith. It was a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Robert's transfer had been blocked, and 3 days after Atticus had filed the formal lawsuit with all the documentation organized by Gill. The town still knew nothing. This was one of the few privileges the slow pace of justice offered. The time between filing and public repercussions, a space of silence where things could still be managed with some discretion. Nara was at the local farmer's market buying spices for the restaurant when Edith found her in line at the butcher shop. Edith was 52. With short greying hair, she dyed a reddish-brown that fooled no one but she kept out of habit, and a way of speaking that mixed urgency with the drawn-out rhythm of someone who had spent her entire life in that town and knew that things happen when they're meant to happen. "Nara," she said, gently pulling her arm to the side of the line, away from the other people. "I need to tell you something I should have told you before, but I didn't know if it was important." Nara remained quiet, waiting. Edith lowered her voice slightly. "Do you remember I told you about the man from Atlanta who went to Silas Miller's office?" "I remember. I didn't tell you everything." She paused, as if still deciding whether to go all the way. "This man, when he left Silas's office, stood in the parking lot making a call. I was leaving for lunch and walked by. It wasn't on purpose. I just happened to pass. But I heard his name on the phone." "What name?" Edith looked around. "Arthur Drummond." Nara stood still. "He said it like this," Edith continued carefully. "Arthur Drummond won't be able to prove anything because the partner has access to the same documents he does." And then he said a name I didn't know, but I wrote it down on my phone because I thought it was strange. She took her phone from her pocket and showed the screen to Nara. The name was Cassian Drummond. Nara took the walk back to the restaurant to organize what that meant. Cassian Drummond. The same last name. There was no coincidence with a last name like that in a town the size of Maplewood. Either he was a relative or he was the same person. And if it was the same, there was a connection between Robert Caxton and someone in Arthur's family that neither of them had mentioned. She arrived at the restaurant, walked past the kitchen without stopping, went directly to the office and knocked on the door. Arthur was on the phone. When he saw her expression, he hung up without finishing the conversation. "Who is Cassian Drummond?" she asked. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds, but it was the kind of silence that carried more weight than many speeches. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said, "My younger brother." Nara stood in the doorway. "You don't speak?" she asked carefully. "No, not for 7 years." He said this with the flat voice of someone who had learned not to feel it in order to keep functioning. "We had a fight over my father's inheritance. I got the business. He left for Atlanta saying I had stolen his share. And had you?" The question came out before she could assess whether she should ask it. But she had learned over those weeks that the questions that hurt are the ones that need to be asked. Arthur was silent for a long moment. Then he said, with an honesty that seemed to come at a high cost, "Not the way he said, but I could have been fairer. I knew it and did it my way because it was more convenient for me." Nara nodded slowly. "So, Cassian found Robert," she said. It wasn't a question. It was the logic assembling itself aloud. Or, Robert found Cassian. And they both had different reasons to want to harm you. "Robert wanted the money," Arthur said, following her reasoning. "Cassian wanted... what?" "Maybe he just wanted you to suffer," she said with simplicity. "Sometimes that's all it is. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that." Arthur stared at the wall for a while. There was a pain in that expression that was different from all the others she had seen in him, not the pain of someone betrayed by a stranger, but the older, deeper pain of someone who recognizes a knot in their own story that they themselves had tied. "I needed to know this," he said at last. "I know," she replied. "And now Atticus needs to know too." The call to Atticus happened that same morning. The lawyer listened to everything without interrupting, and then remained silent for a few seconds. His silence, Nara had learned, was different from Gil's. Gil was quiet when processing numbers. Atticus was quiet when strategizing. "This changes some things," he said at last. "If we can demonstrate that there was collusion between the partner and a third party to deliberately harm the company, the lawsuit ceases to be merely a matter of financial misappropriation and takes on a different nature, more serious for those involved." "What do you need, sir?" Nara asked, because Arthur had put the phone on speakerphone and she was on the other side of the table. "The name you have. And anything that connects this Cassian to Robert before the misappropriations began. Date, message, any verifiable contact." Nara opened her hardcover notebook. There was a note she had made months ago without knowing what it meant, the record of a visit Robert had made to the restaurant accompanied by a younger man she hadn't recognized who had waited outside while Robert talked to Arthur. She had noted the date and briefly described the man: tall, dark hair, a small scar on his right eyebrow. She read the description to Atticus. Then she looked at Arthur. He had become very quiet. "That scar," he said, his voice low. "It was from a fall he had when he was 8. I was with him when it happened." The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was the silence of two things that meet after a long time apart: personal history and the history of the lawsuit. The past Arthur had tried to leave behind, and the present that had returned to collect its due. Atticus said that was enough to include Cassian as a party in the lawsuit. He said he would file an amendment later that week. Then he hung up. Arthur and Nara were left alone in the office. The ceiling fan spun slowly, as always. Outside, Maplewood's heat made the Main Street asphalt shimmer with that hot day sheen that slightly distorts the landscape, as if the town were breathing. "I need to talk to Cassian," Arthur said after a while. "I know. Not because of the lawsuit. Before that." Nara looked at him. There was something on his face that she recognized, the expression of someone who had carried a burden for too long and was considering the possibility of setting it down. Not certainty, not yet, but consideration. "That's your decision alone," she said, "and only you know if it's the right time." He nodded. He stood in silence. Then, with a voice that had the texture of something coming from deep within, "Do you think it can be fixed?" Nara thought for a moment. Not for an answer that sounded right, but for one that was true. "I don't know," she said, "but I know that what you don't try to fix becomes a burden for the rest of your life. And you're already carrying enough weight." The formal lawsuit against Robert Caxton concluded 4 months later. It wasn't quick, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't without cost. The second restaurant, Drummond's Downtown Bistro, had to close for 3 weeks during an especially intense phase of the process, when Robert's lawyers tried to challenge the validity of the documents presented. The challenge was unsuccessful because the documentation Gill had organized based on Nara's notes was too solid to be overturned by formal questioning. But the 3 weeks of closure cost money, and the money Robert had siphoned didn't return in full. It never does. That was a reality Atticus had made clear from the beginning. Arthur recovered part of what he had lost, not everything. And that difference between what had been and what remained was a wound that would heal with time but leave a scar. Robert Caxton was formally removed from the partnership with legal registration and public record. He wasn't arrested. The case was civil, not criminal, and the evidence, though sufficient for the civil scope, didn't meet the threshold for criminal prosecution. This was one of the hardest parts for Arthur to accept. Seeing a man who had stolen from him for 2 years continue circulating through town, smiling at Sunday services, as if his formal exclusion from the partnership was just a business disagreement. But a small town has a memory, and Maplewood, which had watched the process through the murmurs and hallway whispers that arrived before any official news, did its own accounting. The contracts Robert had with local businesses were, one by one, not being renewed. The sponsorship of the annual July 4th picnic at St. Christopher's Park went to another name. There was no public declaration, no formal judgment. It was just the silent, slow way small towns adjust their maps when they discover they've mislabeled a point they once deemed reliable. Cassie and Drummond arrived in Maplewood the month after the process concluded. It wasn't a movie-style reconciliation, no hugs in the rain, no forgiveness speech with background music. It was a 3-hour conversation on a Saturday afternoon at a diner booth by the main road, with 2 glasses of iced tea because neither wanted alcohol for that. Arthur had told Nara later, with the conciseness of someone still processing, that Cassian had arrived angry, that the anger had lasted the first hour, and that in the second hour there was something that seemed like weariness, and that in the third hour there was something that wasn't peace, but was heading in the same direction. "He's going back to Atlanta," Arthur said, "but we exchanged numbers." Nara said nothing. She just listened. 7 years is too long to hold on to something that could have been resolved with a conversation, he said, more to himself than to her. "It is," she agreed. The day Arthur called Nara for a conversation in his office on an October afternoon, 4 months after the process concluded, she thought for a second that she was being fired. Not for any concrete reason. It was the old reflex of a woman who had learned more than once in her life that good things don't arrive unannounced and bad things come when you least expect them. But it wasn't a dismissal. Arthur had a proposal on the table. He had consulted Atticus, he had consulted Gill, he had spent weeks reviewing the numbers. He was formalizing the management of the 3 restaurants with a more organized structure, a general manager for each location, with real autonomy to make operational decisions. And he had thought, with a seriousness that was visible in the way he stared at the table before speaking, that the most suitable person to take over the management of the main restaurant was Nara. It wasn't a consolation promotion. It was a position with a different salary, formal responsibility, with her name on the contract. Nara looked at him for a moment. Then she asked, "Why now?" It was the same question he had asked her weeks ago, inverted, and he responded with the same honesty she had used then. "Because I should have done it sooner. And because I learned that delaying a right decision doesn't make it more right. It just makes it more costly." She remained silent for a while. She looked at her hands, at the black-covered notebook that was, as always, in her apron pocket. She thought of the 8 years. She thought of the chopped onions, the seasoned beans, the early mornings waking before the sun, the notebooks filled with tiny handwriting she had kept without anyone asking, because that's how she had learned to survive. She thought of Caleb waiting for dinner, and Lana in Gainesville, and Gary, who had vanished taking their savings and everything she had built alone after that. Then she said, "I need 2 days to think about it." Arthur nodded. "Of course." She stood up, adjusted her apron, and went to the kitchen to finish preparing dinner. Raymond was humming that same country tune. Toby was folding napkins in the dining room, and the smell of spices filled the rooms with that familiarity that sometimes weighs and sometimes sustains, depending on the day. Nara paused for a second at the kitchen entrance, facing the stoves. She thought there was a version of herself, the version from 8 years ago who had walked into that kitchen with a backpack and a handwritten resume, who wouldn't have believed it if someone had told her what was to come. Not the position. The position was important, but it wasn't the biggest thing. The biggest thing was what had happened along the way, that she had discovered once again and in a different way that what kept her standing wasn't luck or anyone's protection, but the patient stubbornness of paying attention when others looked away. She put the spoon in the beans and went to work. 2 days later, on a Wednesday morning with the sun already warm at 7 a.m. and the scent of wet earth rising from the streets after a passing pre-dawn shower, Nara walked into Arthur's office before he arrived, placed a coffee on his desk, and left a sheet of paper beside it. It was her acceptance of the proposal, handwritten in the tiny, meticulous script of someone who learned to write late and never stopped. With one condition, she had added, that Raymond receive a raise, she specified, because he had held the kitchen together during the difficult days and deserved to be recognized for it. When Arthur arrived and found the paper, he read it slowly. He read the condition about Raymond. He looked at it for a while with that expression that had become familiar over those months, the unresisting recognition of a man who had learned to see what was in front of him. He picked up a pen, signed below her acceptance, and added, in the large handwriting of someone who doesn't write often but makes sure it's legible when they do, Raymond approved. Then he went to the kitchen, picked up the second cup of coffee Nara had prepared, and sat on the chair near the counter, not the office chair but the kitchen chair on the side where she worked, and stayed there, drinking his coffee in silence while she prepared the rice for lunch. It wasn't a grand ending. There was no music, no speeches, none of the things endings usually have when told to impress. It was just 2 cups of coffee, a Wednesday morning, and the smell of maple wood drifting in through the open kitchen window, the damp earth, the spices, the heat that arrived before everything else. It was the smell of a place that endured, because there were people who had refused to let it fall. And that, in the end, was enough. The end.